You know, keeping up with these handheld emulators is really difficult because it seems like every single week a new one releases, and in some cases it's just iterations of the old handheld that already worked fine. But in this case, we've seen Anbernic do some very interesting things with the form factor for these devices while still sticking to the core components that have made some of these systems fan favorites. And actually, one came out recently that I think at this time is probably my favorite handheld that they've made, and that is the RG35XXH. It's a revision, basically, of the RG35XX Plus, which, man, their naming really needs a revision, actually. But either way, the H model, the newest one, I think is probably the best for its money, specifically the price to performance and what it offers, and today I wanted to go over that. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure that like button and subscribe if you're new. Now, I've talked about some of these different handhelds that fall in that lower price range before, whether it is the Miu Mini Plus or the RG35XX, and for this one, it still falls in line with that price point, where it's sitting currently on their website at $67.99. Of course, there is shipping and tax based on your state or region, so it will creep above that $70 mark, but for all intents and purposes, I will just show this as a $70 system because I think that's roughly about what you would expect to spend on something like this. Looking at its specifications, though, it basically shares all the same specs that the RG35XX Plus has. There's still that H700 quad-core ARM Cortex-A53 at 1.5 gigahertz. You do have the dual-core G31 MP2 GPU, 1 gigabyte of LPDDR4 memory, and it does come with a 64 gigabyte micro SD card, although mine was a bit finicky, so I just replaced it with a standard 128 gigabyte card. These, of course, are all over Amazon, but I tend to stick with some of the more name brand ones. I'll leave a link to one that I did pick up on Amazon down below. Connectivity is very strong as well. 2.4 and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi at actually 802.11ac, which is pretty quick there, and then Bluetooth 4.2. Looking around the handheld, we do have a D-pad on the left side that is actually very good. In fact, the center point is hard to push down on, so you do have nice clean inputs all the way around when you're playing, say, a platformer. Might be a little harder for a fighting game, but in that instance, I would actually go down to the analog stick there located below both the D-pad and then the face buttons A, B, X, and Y, as you do have a dual analog setup here. These are similar to the Joy-Con analog sticks in their travel for like the Switch, so left, right, up, and down. You're not having like a full stick travel that you would have with like an Xbox or a PlayStation controller, but for the form factor we're going with here, where they're trying to keep it slimmer, I think this works well enough. You do also have start and select at the top. On the very top of the system, we have L1, L2, R1, R2. There is an audio input jack for headphones. We have 2 USB-C ports. So, for example, if you want to charge with one, transfer with the other, you can do all of that. One is marked, though, as DC, so for charging. You do have a function button here. So if you're in an emulator, it will work to bring up the sub menu if you have to do any kind of option changes. And then we have a HDMI port. On the bottom, we have slots for 2 SD cards. One you would most likely keep your OS on, and then maybe the other you would have as just storage for your ROMs, although I didn't really find any issues just with that 128 gigabyte card and leaving it in slot 1 with the OS along with my ROMs. You also have 2 speakers on the bottom, which is a nice upgrade technically from the RG35XX Plus. However, these speakers are located on the bottom, so they don't project directly at you like the single speaker does on the 35XX Plus. Still, though, it was fairly loud overall, unless I decided to just cover them up on purpose, whether with my hand or actually standing it up on a table. On the right side, you do have the power button and reset button, and then on the left, you have a volume rocker. Flipping it around to the back, the transparent plastic really shows off here, where you can see the battery directly through it, taking up a good chunk of that back plate. And then we have 2 rubberized pads here. This, from what I can tell, is mostly for if you put it down, say, on a table. It does doesn't move much at all. At the center of the RG35XXH, we do have that 3.5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 640 by 480, which matches up really, really well with that aspect ratio that we expect from the PS1, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast generation. And that's sort of the roof for this handheld, which I think is very, very important to realize here. Some of the limitations before we go over examples of this thing playing games. I wouldn't buy this system expecting it to play GameCube, PS2, even Sega Saturn games. For that section, you'd have to go up a tier and most likely spend twice as much as what this costs. So you'd find yourself around that $150 to $200 range if you want to play those sorts of games. I also wouldn't recommend this necessarily for PSP games, as my time with that has been kind of mixed, where while some were okay, like Patapon, for example, others, like God of War, which is a bit more demanding, you can see the frame rate dips around to the 18 to 25 frames, and the audio crackles and skips quite a bit. Even Tekken, I was having some issues with. It certainly was not fluid at all. So you will find some games in the PSP library that at least run well enough to be passable, but I would not expect this to be something that would handle most PSP games. But with that said, if you're going into this expecting compatibility for PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast, you're going to be pretty happy. And especially if you're mostly just looking for Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Game Boy, no problem. In fact, I think we're to the point where we pretty much expect most of these gaming handhelds for emulation to come out now, even at the $70 price point, to handle those no problem. This one does that really well. In fact, I mean, the screen is great for these different games. It looks awesome. Like the IPS display really shows off these titles that fit well with this aspect ratio. And if you're mostly going to be sticking to Super Nintendo games, Game Boy Advance games, the control scheme, I think, works better than what you see with anything that has the Game Boy DMG form factor, because when you have your hands spread out a bit more and there's more real estate to hold on to here with this handheld, it does feel more like a Game Boy Advanced, and it feels more like a Super Nintendo controller. Now let's talk about the generation that most people are probably looking at this handheld for, and that would be PlayStation, N64, and of course Dreamcast. Dreamcast is actually pretty good. Now, it's also going to be very dependent on what firmware you load on this thing, and that's another interesting aspect to these different handhelds for Ambernick or for like the Miu Mini stuff, is there is an entire modding scene around these that is very, very intriguing with what they're doing for the OS, as they're working to also sort of optimize these handhelds for emulation. So they'll have different emulators that are loaded up, and you can kind of pick and choose which one you want to utilize, and your experience will very much depend on which ones you pick. I've had some where Dreamcast games won't even load, same with Nintendo 64, but then jumping over to like Mupin or others, all of a sudden you'll see it start to load up and actually run fairly well. The only thing with this is the out-of-the-box experience is still going to need some tinkering, and even then, your results are going to vary. So for me, my N64 experience so far on this system has been lower resolution, we'll say. Like, the text looks a bit blurrier, the character models do as well, and reading up on this a bit as we are seeing more and more of these firmwares pushed for the H model, we are starting to see more options for emulators that have cleaned this up a bit more. So keep in mind, if you're struggling with an emulator, whether it's the way it looks or the way it's running, you may want to look around at some of the firmwares that are out there to see if maybe that can solve your problem. Otherwise, though, N64 games run really well here, sort of. So some of this does come back to the N64 controller itself, because the right stick, as you can see with Mario 64, is mapped to those C buttons, which works well with Mario 64 because that is the camera. So you move the camera around with the right stick, the left stick moves Mario. It all works. But if you're playing a game that uses the C buttons for anything else, like Ocarina of Time, it's a little weird. Like, that's the thing with the N64 controller. The only thing that really works well with an N64 game is an N64 controller. So working into these handhelds, unless you're going to make one specifically around an N64 controller, is always going to be a bit awkward. But I guess if you get used to it, it would be fine, like moving your analog stick right for C button right and stuff. Although for fighting games that utilize that, or even Tony Hawk Pro Skater, probably not going to use it on the 64. You would move over to something like the PlayStation 1 or the Dreamcast. And the PlayStation 1 works really well here. I mean, I was jumping around to all kinds of different games that I loaded onto this SD card, where there's like Gran Turismo or Wipeout or Spyro, and it didn't skip a beat at all. This is an awesome experience, again, paired with that IPS display for PS1 games. And with just how deep the PS1 library is, to then be able to load onto a handheld like that is something that probably would have blown my mind when I was a kid getting a PS1 for the first time. So definitely explore the PS1 library thoroughly if you pick up any of these handhelds. The Dreamcast is another interesting one because I did have to play around with the emulation selection, like which Flycast it was using, and I went to like Flycast Extreme, and at that point it played everything really, really well. Some did have frame drops, especially like Sonic Adventure 2, that did some odd stuff when a lot of things were happening in that first level with cars flying all over the place, mostly dropping down to like 45, 46 frames per second. So you see what I'm saying? It's not like down to 20 frames, something like that, but there are some stutters here and there as you're going through. But then things like Virtua Tennis ran pretty well, and that's one of my favorite games from the Dreamcast. As weird as that is to say, the arcade tennis games back then with Sega were on like another level. But hey, Crazy Taxi ran perfectly, and it's one that translates pretty well with sort of its color scheme and art style to this 3.5-inch display. And of course, have to load up Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, one of my favorite games of that generation. And you can really go either way, PS1 version, Dreamcast version. I think the Dreamcast version looks a bit better, but the PS1 version plays better in terms of the frame rate for these emulators. Of course, I did want to open up this system because I have been interested as we've gone along, and clearly they've been doing a lot of development internally on these systems because the H feels like a higher quality device than you would expect. One, for $70, and two, for anyone who's been around some of these emulation handhelds for a while now. They didn't exactly start off with a high quality feel, but they have certainly been evolving and building for quite some time here. Here's an issue though. I turn the thing over and look, and they're using some weird screw to get into it. And I understand they don't want people opening these things up and modifying them or doing stuff to the internals, but still, it's like, just use a Phillips head screw, because you're going to see soon. Once I did get these screws out, which I happened to come across a bit that at least fit there well enough and allowed me to unscrew it. I had some clips around the edges, which you can see through the clear plastic and easily get to with a spudger, maybe a fingernail. But once you get the back off, you just have Phillips head screws holding the board down. It's obviously a security measure, but it's a really annoying one. Anyway, with the back plate off, we can see that the battery plugs in, which is awesome for repairability, even though I understand most people, if one of these things breaks on them, considering everything's housed on the SD card, you'll probably just opt to buy another one rather than repair the thing, since it comes in at like $70. Nonetheless, the battery on the back here we can see is a 3,300 milliamp hour, and Ambernick says it'll give you roughly 8 hours, and I will tell you this, I spent maybe 2 hours collecting footage of playing a bunch of different games across all these different emulators, and after I was done that, I was at roughly 68% battery, I think, so that's also me turning up the brightness and doing other things here, especially with some of the more intensive games, so maybe you could get 8 hours. I'm going to realistically say 5 to 6 hours, especially if you're playing some of the more demanding PS1, N64, or Dreamcast games. We do have our rumble motor here on the side. It is soldered directly in, so when you're playing any of these games that do have rumble enabled, you kind of get a little vibration. It sort of reminds me of like rumble motors that are in certain cell phones, for example. So it's kind of that little buzz that you get. The Wi-Fi antenna is also attached to the back next to the battery. It just attaches through pressure to these two little pins here on the back, so when it's all screwed together, it'll make that connection, and I think it's a pretty good spot for the Wi-Fi antenna. It's pushed right up against plastic. There shouldn't be much interference around it since your fingers really aren't going to cover it. The center of the board, we can see our H700 chip as well as the RAM directly next to it, and because this chip is lower powered, it does not need any kind of active cooling, which is nice. One, there's one less part that can fail with the fan, and two, the thing is completely silent even when you're playing some more intense games. Oh, and take a look at how many Phillips head screws they used to hold this motherboard down. And that's something you will notice when you're holding the system, is it does feel very, very solid. And things like this, where they are putting screws all over the place, will work to hold that board in place and keep it from creaking or something when maybe you try to bend the system, or you're just holding it very firmly. These are all things that play into that higher quality feel. The LCD is just plugged in through this larger ribbon cable, so once unplugging that, we can then remove the board, which we then have access to our D-pad, and yep, we can see right here there's a big spike directly in the middle of it, which explains why when we're using the D-pad it doesn't have a lot of accidental presses. That big pivot in the middle will make it so that it's very, very difficult to do so. I mean, I'm just really impressed with the build quality on something like this at its price point. Even the motherboard is fairly thick, and with some light bending, it's not really flexing at all. And I even noticed on the front around where that LED is, like they put foam around it, which seems like a small detail, and I guess it kind of is, but it works to eliminate light bleed on the front. This is a very, very easy recommendation at $70. I bought this one myself. They didn't send it to me or anything. I really liked what I saw with the RG35XX Plus, and my biggest criticism was we don't have like a landscape version of this in existence. And then they come out with the H model, which is pretty much what I was asking for outright. But let me know what you guys think about this down below, specifically with some of these Anbernic handhelds that have been coming out, whether it is this H model or maybe the other ones. And like, I think there's a Game Boy Advance SP one that's come out. Let me know if you want me to take a look at that one next. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.